I'm from the Quaker United Nations Office in Geneva. We're a small NGO working out of Geneva and New York, and we use international law and multilateral processes like the United Nations to uphold the inherent worth of each person, which is something that Quakers believe in. And in line with our pacifist beliefs, we particularly want to use these processes to support those who refuse to fight. And we see some real value in working with the UN, but also some limitations. So one of the benefits we've seen is making it clearer that there is a right to conscientious objection protected in international law, which all countries should respect. But the words on paper around that rarely achieve all of the change that we want to see in the world. And our own work is at its strongest when we can learn from the reality for conscientious objectors in different countries, and when we can link with their advocacy and campaigns. So today I'll focus on the guidance from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the UN's refugee agency, on refugee status for conscientious objectors to military service. And first, just very briefly to say what refugee status is in international law. A refugee is someone who's been forced to flee his or her country due to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. So just to keep that in mind, that's the legal definition. So what I wanted to talk about was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees guidance that relates to asylum seekers. And its official title, in a wonderful UN title, is Guidelines on International Protection Number 10, Claims to Refugee Status Related to Military Service within the context of Article 1A2 of the 1951 Convention and or the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees. So that's its kind of formal grand title. But what does that actually mean? So what it is it provides legal guidance for governments, for lawyers and representatives, and for those who make decisions about refugee status. And it's meant to help get a consistent and principled interpretation of who should get refugee status. So what does it actually say? So it says that conscientious objectors to military service can be eligible for refugee status if they face persecution because of their conscientious objection. As Semi said, one of the challenges is understanding that what COs face is persecution, and it provides some guidelines on how to assess and what sort of things count as persecution. So the starting point for the UNHCR guidelines is that states have the right to compel their citizens to perform military service. But this must always be in line with international law and standards, which includes recognizing the right to conscientious objection. It says that this covers selective objectors and absolute objectors, and recognizes that people who are in the military can develop a conscientious objection. And it's clear that this must be available to everybody and not just to those from a certain religious group, or not solely on the basis of religious objection, but also, as they put it, broader considerations of thought and conscience, including moral, ethical, and humanitarian or similar views. So does that mean that it says that everybody should get refugee status if there's no recognition of conscientious objection in a country? No. It says that if there's no recognition of conscientious objection, then it will depend on the consequences of that for the conscientious objector. For example, they say that being forced to do military service or being prosecuted or disproportionately punished would mean that somebody should be seen as a refugee, and that the same is true if somebody has a threat of that happening. It doesn't actually have to have happened to them yet. If there's a threat of that, then that also would be seen as persecution. And so does this mean that if a country recognizes CO, then somebody cannot get refugee status? Or also no, they say that if there is alternative service, but this is punitive, this could also be grounds for refugee status. For example, if the activity of the alternative service is punitive, they say if the length, but not just if it isn't unequal, but if it's of punitive length, or if the process to apply for conscientious objection status is unregulated or unfair. And the guidance from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is very general here. So it's useful then to look at other guidance from other parts of the United Nations to look at what has been said about what is punitive or an unfair process around conscientious objection. And I'll post a link at the end for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Guidance on Application Procedures, which set out criteria for human rights compliant application procedures for conscientious objection. And if these are not met, then you can say that the process does not allow people to exercise their right to conscientious objection. And that would be part of, even if it says in law it's possible to be a conscientious objector, it has to be possible to exercise that in practice. And the UNHCR guidelines recognise that people may not be able to exercise that right in practice because it's not properly regulated, because the process is unfair, or because they fear significant stigma and persecution for trying to exercise that right. The guidance goes into some more detail about what would be considered as persecution, as Semi mentioned at the beginning, and because that's an important part of the refugee status determination. And here they say it's persecution if the individual is at a risk of a threat to their life, their freedom, or other serious human rights violations or serious harm. For example, excessive prison terms, discrimination, torture, or inhuman or degrading treatment, and that they're clear that this also covers indirect consequences. So not just is somebody prosecuted and put in prison for trying to exercise their right to conscientious objection or refusing military service, but also that if there's violence or severe discrimination or harassment by the community, so not just from the state, or if there's a suspension of rights to own land, to enroll in school, to access social services, then either on its own, if that's very serious, or added together as a cumulative effect, then that should be counted as persecution. And I think that's an important thing to remember around what happens for conscientious objectors around asylum, that it isn't just is there imprisonment or not, but also what are the other impacts on somebody exercising their other rights that stems from non-recognition of conscientious objection, and how does that impact on their lives, and does that meet this threshold of persecution? And the UNHCR guidelines are saying yes, it can in some circumstances. So in summary, the guidance does not say that all conscientious objectors should get refugee status, but it's clear that conscientious objectors to military service can be eligible for refugee status if they face persecution because of their conscientious objection, and it gives useful guidance on some of the things that decision makers should consider. The challenge is, as I said, just because things get written on paper by governments agreeing it or by the UN, that doesn't mean that that's what happens in practice, as we well know. And the guidance leaves quite a lot of room for interpretation for people who are making the decisions about refugee status. And the guidelines are not always followed. So I'll finish with 3 actions that I think people can take to help this process, and 2 actions that I'd like to take or would welcome your input on. And for the 3 actions that people can take around supporting conscientious objectors who are seeking asylum, you can make sure that the government is aware of the guidance from UNHCR and check whether they're following it. For example, is there some specific guidance at national level around conscientious objection or military service and asylum? And if so, is this in line with what UNHCR has said and what international law says? Second is to make sure that somebody's legal representatives in the refugee and asylum seeking process are aware of UNHCR's guidance and aware that this is what the UN's guidance on this is. And the third is about providing information about what's happening in country of origin. And one of you on the call mentioned doing this as part of your work at the beginning, that the guidelines are very clear that reliable and relevant country of origin information can help with the determination. So if you're supporting conscientious objectors claiming asylum, and you can provide some solid evidence about the situation in the country they've come from, that should be taken into account, and that's helpful. And the final two things I wanted to say are ways in which I would welcome your input for things that we could do to help work around this. And that is that if you think it would be useful to have these guidelines in other languages, and the UN has translated them into French, German, Japanese, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, and Turkish. But if there are other languages it would be helpful to have it in, to please let us know, as we may be able to support with that. And also it would be really helpful on this point about checking whether governments are aware of the guidance and how they're using it. It'd be really helpful to know which countries have a national guideline about asylum and conscientious objection. And I would like to see that guidance that countries have, and to think about whether it meets the criteria that UNHCR have set out, and if not, then what we could do about working to change that. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from the others and to your questions. Thank you.